be there, people like Miller and Gorka and others who not only, I think, represent the same thing that Steve Bannon did, but aren't capable of doing the job well. So, yes, I think there's more cleaning house that ought to take place. But as I mentioned in that tweet, Jake, the more fundamental problem is at the very top. I think what the president had to say about the demonstrations in Boston and elsewhere was perfectly fine, perfectly unobjectionable, but also perfectly inadequate after that debacle of a press conference he had supposedly on infrastructure. You know, the real, I think, challenge and job for the chief executive in a country where race has always been such a difficult conversation is to do everything possible to bring our country together, to help make us a more perfect union. And what the president did this week was as if he stood on a line dividing the country and pushed to separate one American from another with all his might. And that is not what this country needs.
After President Trump's comments appearing to equate white supremacists and the counter-protesters, your fellow Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Jackie Speer, tweeted, quote, POTUS is showing signs of erratic behavior and mental instability that place the country in grave danger. Time to invoke the 25th Amendment. That's the amendment that would allow the removal of the president. Do you agree that President Trump is mentally unstable?
Well, I certainly think that there's an issue with the president's capability. There's some attribute of his character that makes him seemingly incapable of introspection and a broad understanding of what the country really needs. And I think it's a question that people are asking, you know, what is going on with this president? What can explain this kind of behavior? You know, it began at the very beginning, Jake. I remember when he had won the election and within days seemed to suggest that the only reason he didn't win the popular vote was that millions of people illegally came to the country and voted. And I thought to myself, oh, my God, this man is not only going to not grow with the job, but is willing to state things that are just patently untrue. I'm convinced if you took somebody off the street of America and you said you've just become president, but here's the deal, you didn't win the popular vote, they would have the common sense to say, look, I'm going to do everything I can to win over everyone. I realize that many people, indeed most people, didn't vote for me, but he didn't do that. He's not capable of doing that, and I don't understand why. But I do recognize what a serious problem it is, and I think more than when I say it or when Jackie Speer says it, the fact that Bob Corker now says things along the same lines shows a broadening recognition that there are some serious issues with our president that aren't going to go away, that aren't going to get better, and indeed, with the pressures of the job, may very well get worse. And I think for that reason, at a minimum, we need the very best people around him in the White House, and that means that not people like Bannon, not people like Miller, not people like Gorka, but rather some more adults in the room.
It sounds like you're saying that you don't disagree with Jackie Speer, who said that President Trump is showing signs of erratic behavior, mental instability, and so it sounds like you're not disagreeing with that. What about the 25th Amendment part, which would call for the removal of the president? Do you agree with that?
You know, I don't think we're at a point of thinking about the 25th Amendment. You know, for one thing, this is something that the vice president and cabinet would need to come together on. I think what the authors of that amendment principally had in mind was some kind of physical incapacitation or serious mental illness or a breakdown, an inability to function in office. And I think we're still far from concluding that that's the case, even though we find many of us his conduct anathema, and there to be a serious problem here. But I don't think it, you know, particularly at this point in time, makes a lot of sense to focus on the 25th Amendment. I do think it means that we have to put real constraints on this president. We have to make sure that our system of checks and balances in Congress work. I think, frankly, the most powerful thing we could do rather than pursue the 25th Amendment at this point is make sure that one house or the other, and ideally both, are in Democratic hands, frankly, the hands of a party not in the White House, to be a more effective check on some of the damage this president can do.
Congressman, let me ask you, President Trump was obviously widely condemned for his comments in which he seemed to be equating both sides for the violence and hatred in Charlottesville. But obviously, let's remove the idea that there's any moral equivalence. Is there any legitimacy to the argument that the violent tactics of groups like Antifa make matters worse and that Democrats and progressives need to condemn them?
You know, anyone that's committing violence ought to be condemned. anyone. There's no justification for it whatsoever. But I do think that that cannot be allowed to obscure the fact that millions of people are gathering around the country and have since this president was inaugurated in the most peaceful form of protests. And we can't allow the commander-in-chief to somehow equate the handful of people that would make those protests violent with any kind of sentiment that condones white supremacy or neo-Nazism. And I think it all gets back to the point you made earlier, Jake, and I think the fundamental problem here is that the President of the United States can't bring himself to repudiate a part of his support, and that is that small group, me, you can do no wrong. And I won't condemn you practically anything that you do. His difficulty during the campaign in your interview to condemn David Duke is not at all unlike the difficulty he's had this week in a full-throated, unequivocal repudiation of sentiment and ideology that we not only find repugnant, but we fought World War over. So I think that's the root of the problem.
Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat of California, thank you so much. Good to see you as always, sir.
Thank you, Jake.
One Republican senator now saying he worries that there's more violence to come, and he says he doubts President Trump can bring the country together in the event that happens. That's next.
I think everything changed last weekend. I think that was one of those moments in a nation's history where everything turns.
That's the mayor of Charlottesville, Michael Signer, speaking just 1 week after that white supremacist rally, the Tiki Torch March through his town. Let's talk about it all with the panel. Bakari Sellers, let me ask you, do you think that it's true that everything changed for the country last weekend?
Well, I think it was a tragic day for the country, but white supremacy is not new. It didn't start with Donald Trump. It has been magnified and lifted up and put on another playing field, but I don't think that anything has necessarily changed. It won't change until individuals who don't look like Nina and I decide that enough is enough. This isn't a partisan issue, and so many people confuse patriotism and prejudice, and what we saw on display was so much prejudice, and I hope that individuals, especially white evangelicals in the United States of America, decide to stand up and say enough is enough, and Donald Trump is perverting and giving these individuals a platform, and he should not. That's all we're asking for.
Congressman, you've seen a lot of the tensions up close this week in your home state, your home Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yeah.
What was your reaction? What do you think?
Well, actually, ironically, I was in Israel when all that stuff was going on and seeing that. So, I agree with some of the things that Bakari said in terms of folks need to rise up. And largely you have seen that, of course. I think there's no place for hate in Virginia or America. And I think that you did see that on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican people coming out and condemning what was going on. It was a tragic day for Virginia and for the nation, of course, too. I was critical of the president of how the second press conference was strong and it hit the right note, but the third was not. But at the same time, I think it's important that politics of identity, racial politics, tribal politics, quite frankly, are not what this nation needs. And anyone who's espousing them, I think, are wrong. I think we should be focused on building this country as opposed to tearing it down.
Nina, what was it like for you this last week?
Heavy, Jake. I want to read a brief quote from Dr. Crystal Fleming. She wrote an article in The Root that I think informs exactly what Bakari just said. She said, it is clear that our nation is in the midst of a very public and painful reckoning with the memory and, among other things, ongoing white supremacy. And that's it. That, in other words, what transpired in Virginia was just a tipping point. But this has been happening in this country all along. And until we go deeper, showing disgust for and standing up very clearly and unified against racism and bigotry like the neo-Nazis and KKK inspired. But we got to go deeper to deal with mass incarceration in this country that locks up more black and brown folks and poor folks. We got to deal with income and wealth inequality, the inequality in our school system. So dealing with neo-Nazis is one thing, but dealing with systemic racism is another. And this is a day of reckoning for our country.
Senator?
Yeah, see, that's that kind of talk that really, I think, it causes problems for a lot of America, that says somehow or another that if you're white, you're somehow racist. And I mean, that's what it said. You talked about systemic racism, and as opposed to neo-Nazis. I agree. I mean, I think everybody has stood up and said, that we're obviously against white supremacy. I don't know of anybody who has spoken in favor of
certainly
this
on the platform.
Yes, certainly nobody that I'm aware of. But the idea then saying, well, this is a larger problem I just would say that we have problems of racism in this country, but that's not tying that to white supremacists. I think is
250 years. 250 years worth of slavery, almost 100 years worth of Jim Crow in this country. The fact that the systems in this country still treat Black folks, in particular, African-American folks, as second-class citizens. And part of what the senator doesn't want to face is also part of the problem. No one has said, Bakari or nobody has said that all white people are racist. But we do in this country have racist institutions. Look, there were white folks out there marching against the neo-Nazis and the KKK. But the fact that we can't deal with systemic racism in this country, something is wrong with that.
I hope that you're uncomfortable with the conversation, because this conversation is uncomfortable. It's something that we have to deal with. But the fact is, we can go to East Chicago and we can go to Flint, Michigan, and let me tell you that they have environmental injustices that do not happen in Orange County. There are places that do not happen in affluent areas of this country, affluent white areas of this country. In South Carolina,
you have poor white areas.
There's no doubt about it. They're suffering. But let's have a conversation about the systemic injustices that we have. And there's a direct.
But the systemic injustices are not necessarily race injustices.
They're also.
You're saying that they're more. You're saying
there are some, but
class is what you're saying.
Yeah, this look.
And then we'll come to it.
This is an issue about, and I think we can agree on that. There are problems in this country where there are millions of people who do not have opportunities and to be able to rise. But you can find that in rural areas of this country, throughout Appalachia and areas of my state and West Virginia, Kentucky, just so you can find them in Detroit and Philadelphia and other places. And to suggest that is racist I just think clouds the issue that we have serious problems to confront here, and covering it with race is, I just think,
let me touch on a couple of things, because I think there's some good points on both sides here. Both Nina and the senator have brought up good points. And when you look at, I think you have to separate some things. So when you look at Virginia, you can't drive 5-10 miles without seeing something that is a monument to the war dead in the Civil War, or a Civil War battlefield, or a monument itself. That is a separate issue for one of the things that Nina brought up, which I agree with. We do have a big problem with criminal justice reform here, and we need improvement. There's no question about that. Economic opportunity for folks, both in white Appalachia as well as in Black communities as well, too. There's no question about that, but you have to separate the two. They are not the same thing.
But they are.
Hold on. They're not the same thing when you're talking about white supremacists and marching and taking monuments, saying that symbol, like a monument to war dead or something like that, or even Jefferson, for example, some of his, and you have seen the conversation move in that direction. There are very real problems that we need to address in criminal justice improvement and other substantive problems. That's not the same thing as marching and taking down a statue that someone has driven by 1,000 times and never even had any problem with.
Income and wealth inequality. My only point is this.
I agree with that.
Is that in our face, overt racism and bigotry that was on display in Virginia is one thing.
Small, tiny little.
But we deal with that. But I'm saying beyond that, and that's what Professor Fleming was saying too. How do we deal with, in this country, systemic racism? I get Appalachia. I visit Appalachia. I travel Appalachia. I understand. I talked to a woman yesterday by the name of Portia who lives in Ohio, who was crying her eyes out. She is on the front lines for racial equality. But she also talks about the fact that in her county, in Ohio, that there are poor white folks, and I get that. And so the fact that we're willing to talk about class, but sometimes you guys don't want to talk about both. Race.
But I can't let you separate that, because that's an easy way out. That's a cop out. And the reason that it's a cop out is because you have this conversation about race. And these statues, these monuments, many of them were erected during the Jim Crow era when we were making progress in civil rights. It was a big thumb in your eye. That's why the Confederate flag went up in South Carolina. That's why these monuments went up throughout the country. And to have a statue of someone,
not all of them.
But that's a lot of them. And to have a statue of someone like a Robert E. Lee, to have a statue of someone like a Pitchfork Ben Tillman, or John C. Calhoun, whose name, by the way, was John C. Killicoon, to have these individuals just revered, Do you understand how a black, you may not, but as a black man, let me tell you, that is very, very painful.
Don't talk condescendingly.
No, I'm not, but I'm just saying that is very painful. And the reason that is painful, and this conversation has to be uncomfortable, the reason that is painful is because
I'm comfortable having these conversations. Let me say, listen, you have to be able to separate some things. There's no question about it. Look, I understand you can be empathetic to understand where you're coming from and where we're coming from. Some of these monuments in Virginia, for example, and there are millions of Virginians who don't support this because some of these are their families, some of those are sacred monuments to war dead. Those are big issues, and their history is very layered. Let me paraphrase the black mayor of Richmond, LeVar Stoney, who's a great man, who said a couple months ago, this has since changed, but a couple months ago he said, because of politics, but he said, keep the statues, but teach the context. Create more statues to teach history and the context. That is extremely important. Our history is not perfect, it's imperfect, but we have the ability to move towards a more perfect union, and most countries don't have that.
We're just going to take a very quick break and continue this conversation. We just have to pay some bills. Stick around.
When heartburn.
But I'm going to give you better information, better tools, better automation.
Right. In this new digital world, you got to be agile. You got to continue to evolve your business models. This needs to be part of your DNA. It's that important to the long-term success of all of our clients.
This week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week? And is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
That was President Trump on Tuesday, his argument that George Washington owned slaves too, so that makes him the same as Robert E. Lee. But the country isn't removing Washington statues, even as there has been a decades-long debate about what to do about Confederate symbols. Trump doubled down on his take on Confederate monuments on Thursday, tweeting, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson? So foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." For Trump, this calculation is easy because most of the country and a majority of his base are actually with him on this. A new poll from NPR, Marist, and the PBS NewsHour finds that 62% of registered voters want the statues to stay put as symbols. And when it comes to white college voters without college degrees, a key group of Trump's base, 3 out of 4 of those voters say keep the statues where they are. Jackie, it certainly was a topic change for this president, really back to an argument that's been going on for decades, back to the 90s, the 80s. Right. So what was this about? Is he actually on safer ground?
He is on safer ground. I mean, it's easier to talk about inanimate statues than it was to be equating very live on tape neo-Nazis carrying assault weapons and torches with counter-protesters. But the figures you cited in that poll were taken sort of early in this brouhaha. Yeah. And to the extent that Trump now associates himself with the statues argument, you might see, I would predict you would see, the percentage of support for the statues remaining come down. Now, the thing about this is one thing Trump also said that gets forgotten is he said it's really left to the locals to decide. Well, the locals have been deciding for a long time, and it picked up after 2 years ago after the mass murder in Charleston. And it's been a very thoughtful, in most cases, debate at the local level about this. And they haven't been talking about taking down Washington and Jefferson.
Right, they haven't.
And so
it's these Confederate symbols.
Roiled these local debates.
Yeah, and Mike Signer had this to say. He was the Charlottesville mayor, and he, I think, talks about what you talks about, that it's sort of a different moment at this point.
All of a sudden, these monuments, these equestrian statues of Civil War generals that were installed in the Jim Crow era here, they became touchstones of terror. They became these kind of twisted totems that these people clearly are drawn to. They're trying to create a whole, architecture of intimidation and terror and hatred around them. It was visited upon our town. It was evil.
Bender, you see some municipalities, college, Duke University, taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee. It does seem like we might be in a different moment, and that Trump might not be on as safe a ground as he thinks he is because of this the sense that these statues now are viewed differently.
Well, I think
because of their association with what happened.
Yeah, I think the point there is the numbers you showed. He's not talking to the people in Charlottesville, a small liberal college town, that see these statues as symbols of racism and symbols of slavery. He's talking to his base, who see these symbols as symbols of political correctness. Right? I mean, this is Trump's brand. Is the anti-establishment outside the box, and for these people, if I can speak for America for a second, they see, the political correctness for them has become this sort of verbal shell game that generally for the white working classes ended up with them being shamed out of a way of thinking, right, shamed out of a way of talking, shamed out of a way of living. And so when they hear Trump defending these sort of things, this is what they see as him bucking the establishment.
Defending them. And, this gets back to the sort of white identity politics and Bannon saying he would love to see Democrats talk about racism every single day. Michael Warren.
Right. It's one of those things that people suggest is how Trump gets elected, right? The sort of PC culture. I was struck by, in that particular statement from Trump at the press conference, how much he sounds like the guy at the end of the bar. And that was such a part of his appeal during the election, right? He was saying the things that you really kind of.
But it's sort of the white guy at the end.
Yeah, well, yes, right? Absolutely. But that is a part of his appeal. The problem is that when you're president, you're not just the white guy at the end of the bar, or you're not just the Republican guy in the working class town at the end of the bar, sort of saying what you sort of viscerally think about PC or the left or whatever. You're speaking to all Americans, and it doesn't have. It may have worked for him in the election. It's not going to work for him as president.
Up next, our reporters share from their notebooks, including the main messaging worry of a non-energized Democratic Party.
Closed captioning brought to you by OnlyMeso.com.
People who have been diagnosed with mesothelioma have many questions. That's why we offer this free book.
Call toll-free at 1-800-400-5415.
Let's close by asking our reporters to share something from their notebooks and help keep you ahead of the curve on the big political news in the coming week.
Much, actually. I'm told that he spent much of his time, particularly in the last several months of his time at the White House, sitting on a couch in the office of Reince Priebus, scrolling through his phone. But what was he doing there? He was trying to run a sort of an outside media campaign against his enemies, on behalf of his agenda. People like H.R. McMaster, Gary Cohn. I guess we're going to see more of that, and it's going to intensify from outside the White House. The difference now will be he's not in the White House, so he may not have the goods that he had while he was a West Wing employee.
Right, unless Trump continues sort of the relationship even after Bannon is gone. Julie?
Democratic activists are pretty energized after this past week, but Democrats that I talked to who are involved in some of the competitive Senate races for 2018 and certainly the efforts to win back the House are a little more anxious about this idea of Democrats going all in on Trump's response to Charlottesville. They see Democrats potentially falling into some of the same traps that they fell into in 2016, where they ran mostly on an anti-Trump message, and the party still feels like it's an economic message that needs to resonate with voters. The irony, of course, is that Chuck Schumer and some other Democrats have rolled out an economic blueprint for Democrats, but it's been completely overshadowed this summer by all of the antics surrounding Trump in the White House.
Yeah, they still got some work to do. Jackie.
I wanted to talk about the helplessness of the Republican establishment in sort of dealing with Trump. And after a week like this, it really underscored that. I talked to a couple very well-known, formerly high-placed Republicans over dinner, and the way they described what Trump was doing forced me to ask, have you thought about an intervention? Is it possible to do an intervention? Sort of like most dramatically we saw during the Nixon years when senior Republican senators went to Nixon and essentially told him it was time to resign. And on a far less dramatic way in the Reagan years when senior Republicans would go in the Senate, generally, would go to Ronald Reagan if they thought his agenda on taxes or deficit reduction was not what it should be. In this case, so I raised this question of an intervention, and the most senior of the two Republicans looked at me and said, he's a classic narcissist. He's a crazy narcissist.
Wow.
And you cannot get someone like that to change And the other guy's going, and so it came up 2 more times, and each time he looked at me and said, crazy narcissist, as if to shut me off.
Wow, that's major. Michael, what do you have?
Tax reform. Now that the president is back from vacation, watch for him
Not much of a vacation.
Yeah, watch for him to finally start his big kickoff for his public push for tax reform. I'm told the West Wing has identified a Rust Belt city for a first major event on August 28th. And what they'd really like this tour to eventually include is a stop in California in Simi Valley at the Reagan Library, which includes the desk where former President Reagan signed the last major tax reform 3 decades ago.
I mean, yeah, sort of the symbolism of that. We'll see. And I'll close with this. The Democratic National Committee's July fundraising numbers are in, and they aren't good. The haul was just $3.8 million compared to the Republican National Committee's $10.2 million. More numbers that show a much fuller picture. In total, the RNC has $47.1 million to the DNC's $6.9 million. Now, often it's easier for parties to rake in the cash when they have a sitting president, but for some progressive Democrats, the paltry numbers are a reflection of Tom Perez and proof that the Democratic establishment just can't get it done. Republicans say that for all of the supposed anti-Trump fervor, there is a lack of enthusiasm for the National Party and their better deal messaging. For their part, the DNC says it's still early and the rebuilding of the brand and the party's infrastructure is still ongoing. They also say that they think they'll have the resources they need for the rest of the year in 2018. Time will certainly tell. That's it for Inside Politics. Thanks for sharing your Sunday morning with us. Be sure to catch us weekdays at noon Eastern. Up next, State of the Union with Jake Tapper.
When you've been making delicious natural cheese for over 100 years like Kraft has, you learn a lot about what people want.
Honey, do we have like a super creamy cheese with taco spice already in it?
The most trusted name in news.
Passion and anger as thousands take to the streets and about racism and free speech. What can be done to calm the country's racial unrest? And shocking words. President Trump faces bipartisan backlash for his reaction to the violence at a neo-Nazi demonstration in Charlottesville.
I think there's blame on both sides.
Did the president's words embolden white supremacists? Plus, Bannon ousted. President Trump fires his embattled chief strategist.
We'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon.
Now the former Trump insider vows to go to war, using a far-right website as his weapon. But who is he going to war against? Hello, I'm Dick Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is still reeling. Just 7 days after the violent, deadly neo-Nazi and Klan protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, a much calmer scene in Boston. Police estimating 40,000 protesters, almost all of them peaceful, took to the streets to protest Nazis, the Klan, white supremacists, and the alt-right. President Trump at first took to Twitter to condemn anti-police agitators, as he called them, but then an hour later, a change was made in his tweet. Quote, I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one, a different tone from the previous tweet. It was a much different response as well than the one we saw earlier in the week when President Trump refused to place blame solely for the violence and hatred on the groups of hateful bigots who came to Charlottesville to spew hatred of Jews, African Americans, and other minorities.
There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides, I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either.
The president also saying that there were very fine people on both sides, and he faced withering bipartisan criticism for those comments. Capped his week off as well by firing chief strategist Steve Bannon, one of the strongest nationalist voices in his White House. Joining me now to talk about all of this plus more, Republican Governor of Ohio, John Kasich. Governor, thanks for joining us today. What is your reaction to the firing of Steve Bannon? Do you think it's a positive or negative step for the nation?
Well, Jake, that's up to the president. You know, when the problem you have is when you have chaos among your staff in, staff out, new people here, new people there, it's hard to get anything done. You have to be focused. You have to build a team, and it has to be a team that can argue, including argue with the president, like my staff argues with me as the governor. But at the end of the day, we all row in the same direction, and we all have the same purpose. My concern is when you have that kind of chaotic situation in terms of staff, they need to settle it down. But the president clearly has a right to have the people that he wants around him. The way that I believe it works best is when you get people with different points of view. You sit down, you argue out issues carefully, and then at the end you all come together. And if you're not going to go along with the leader, then you have to leave. And so I don't know what all the inner workings are. But they've got to get some stability among the staff. And I think that's probably what General Kelly is trying to do with so many changes here in the last couple of weeks. But the changes have to stop, and we have to have a team. You can't keep putting new people in the lineup and think you're going to win a world championship.
You called the president's response to the violence in Charlottesville, quote, pathetic. Mitt Romney says that he thinks President Trump needs to actually apologize to the nation, acknowledge he was wrong, in order to avoid, quote, an unraveling of our national fabric. Do you agree? Do you think President Trump needs to apologize?
I think, Jake, in some ways, we're looking backwards, okay? Where I want to look now is what are we going to do to deal with the fundamental issues that we have in the country, the issue of race, the issue of police and community coming together and developing policing methods that can unify. We've done it in Ohio. The need to reform a welfare system. So instead of just having people do make work, and a lot of people don't know this, if you're on welfare and you get cash assistance right now, you have to work 30 hours a week. People don't know that. If you don't work, we take you off of welfare. The point is that effort, that time you have to put in to be responsible needs to be meaningful. We got to get people to job training so they're not stuck in poverty for generations. We need to think about what we can do to make sure minorities have a piece of the pie. What we have to do in our country to make sure that we begin to discuss the difference between the wealthiest and the poorest in our country. All these things, if we can have a dialogue on that, that is what's going to bring people together. And people who have very different points of view, if they have goodwill, it's amazing how much we can agree upon.
Well, Governor, I think one of the issues is that there are a lot of people in the middle, on the left, even on the right, who are very troubled because they believe President Trump has difficulty condemning white supremacists. Why do you think he does seem to have this issue? Do you think he's concerned about alienating bigots because they might be a part of his base?
Well, look, I didn't see all of his reaction yesterday to the rally in Boston, which was very uplifting. The police were fantastic in the way they handled it. There were so many protesters saying we reject hate. And my understanding is the president came out and praised people, praised the police, praised the fact that the radicals were really marginalized, and that those who marched against hate, he praised. So, look, I think it's all, Jake, about people getting to him and explaining to him we've got to bring the country together. And, you know, blaming one side or another when we're talking about the KKK or white supremacy, there is no comparison between these hate groups and everybody else. So I feel positive about what he had to say about Boston from what I understand in the news reports.
President Trump is scheduled to hold a campaign-style rally in Phoenix, Arizona, Tuesday. The Democratic mayor of Phoenix has expressed concern. He says he hopes President Trump postpones it in light of all the recent events. Glenn Thrush of the New York Times tweeted, quote, lots of nervousness in White House and in Trump's broader circle about this trip to Arizona. Do you have any concerns about President Trump holding this rally on Tuesday in Arizona?
Jake, let me say just a couple things. Look, the president is our president. We want him to be successful. People around him have to get to him, including his own family, to say, okay, you need to show leadership. You need to bring the country together. If you're going to go to Phoenix and make a speech, fine. That's your right. You can go there. He's got free speech just like the rest of us have it. But when you go, try to use that as an opportunity to say something that's going to bring people together. You might recall when he delivered that speech to the Congress, the day after, the people on CNN said, well, tonight Donald Trump became president. He has it within him. If he can maintain discipline, he has it within him, I think, to overcome this and move forward. Because if all we're doing is questioning his motives and what's in his heart, and the right and the left, all we're doing is fighting and yelling back and forth, Jake, you're all asking the question, how does the country make it with all this fighting? This is ridiculous at this point. Everybody in America needs to take a deep breath and think about your children and think about our country. We don't do well when all we do is fight. So let's all take a deep breath and let's think about what we can do to heal some of the basic issues in this country, which are still out there. That's why I'm going to go, for example, to Appalachia. A lot of people poor, they're not minorities. They look like you and me, Jake. The fact is, we got to get to the nub of why people think they don't have opportunity, and we need to fix that because America is the land of opportunity. I'm sorry to go on and on here, but I just feel strongly now that we got to just stop it. Stop it now and figure out how to find things that we can agree upon.
All right, Governor, stay right there. We have much more to talk about. We're going to take a quick break. Coming up next, a report this week that Governor Kasich might be more convinced now that someone needs to challenge Trump in the primaries in 2020. We'll talk about that next. Stay with us.
Hello, everybody.
Wait, so you got rid of Verizon just like that?
Closed captioning brought to you by Act Oral Care. For a healthier mouth, go beyond brushing with Act.
Megan's smile is getting a lot of attention because she uses Act mouthwash. Act strengthens enamel, protects teeth from harmful acids, and helps prevent cavities. Go beyond brushing with Act.
We're back with Ohio Governor John Kasich. Governor, according to a report this week, sources close to you are saying there's a growing sense of, quote, moral imperative for President Trump to face a primary challenge in 2020. Now, I know you're not going to announce any plans on my show, and you've made no plans, but if everything continues as it has been, does a Republican need to step forward to challenge President Trump in 3 years?
Well, Jake, as you said, I don't have any plans to do anything like that. I'm rooting for him to get it together. We all are. I mean, we're only like 7 months into this presidency. And, you know, look, what we have to start thinking about, all of us, not just the president, but down where we live, in the neighborhoods, in the communities, we got to build a stronger America. Look, why am I on this show? Support my country. So what I hope is going to happen is I hope we're going to have stability. The president is going to learn from these episodes, and we're going to do better. That's what I hope is going to happen. We'll have to wait and see.
Minutes ago, Defense Secretary Mattis announced that President Trump has made a decision about what to do next in Afghanistan, though we haven't heard what the decision is. This is what you had to say about troop levels in Afghanistan last year. Take a listen.
I now believe we need to get out of Afghanistan. If I were president, I wouldn't be announcing the timeline, but I would give the aircraft that the Afghans need, and I'd get out of there.
There are an estimated 8,400 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Do you think President Trump should be planning a complete withdrawal of U.S. troops?
Well, I wouldn't be in favor of him trying to add troops. Here's the thing. We've been there 16 years. We went there primarily to make sure that Afghanistan was not going to be a launching pad into the United States with terrorism. We largely have accomplished that. But somehow we've gotten ourselves involved in nation building, trying to build a strong central government in a country where central governments don't work. It's done in a regional way. My view would be, no, I think we need to begin to leave there, and I think we can reserve the opportunity to use intelligence to be able to strike any of these training camps, any of these places where our intelligence community begins to think that they're now building a base and a launching pad that would be harmful to us and to our allies. So continuing to put more troops in is not the way I think we should go. I think we should begin to leave, and then I think we should reserve the opportunity and the right with the proper basing of our forces in the region to be able to strike if we think that there is an effort being made to create another launching pad. But to just stay there after 16 years, I want our people to be able to come home.
North Korea.
Thank goodness I didn't change my mind from a year ago, Jake.
That's right. It's not a good gotcha. You stand by what you said. North Korea, of course, has threatened the U.S. and South Korea ahead of tomorrow's planned military drills between the U.S. and South Korea. North Korea calling them reckless behavior, driving the situation into the uncontrollable phase of a nuclear war. These exercises, of course, come after these weeks of growing tensions in the region, with North Korea focusing on American targets such as Guam and possibly Hawaii. Do you think that the U.S. should consider postponing these drills?
Not at this point. I think if they were like 2 weeks in the future, perhaps we could consider it. But when both General Mattis and Tillerson and negotiators negotiated all over the world, have a sense that we have to keep the pressure on, I agree with that. I will give credit to administration that has talked about how important it is to protect the continental United States and that we're going to have every option on the table. And I think it's gotten the attention of the Chinese. A lot of people poo-poo the Chinese are not going to do anything. Let me just tell you, Jake, if I were the president of the United States and we had a regime like North Korea and they were able to develop the technology to target the United States of America, we would have no choice but to take those systems out. No choice. And it would change the very fabric of that peninsula. And so if the Chinese are worried about what's going to happen in North Korea, the best way to have things happen that they don't like is just to sit back and do nothing. I think they're beginning to put the heat on Un, that dictator over there. So at this point, I think we've continued with the exercises, but we look for a way to get some sort of a freeze on that program, a very viable freeze, and begin to think about how, over time, we could have a more stable group of people who run North Korea.
But you would not only not rule out, but you would enact a preemptive strike if North Korea were proven to be establishing and developing nuclear-capable ICBMs that could hit the United States?
Let me put it to you, well, let me put it to you this way, Jake. I wouldn't take a chance on a government that unstable and a leader who's that erratic to be able to have the capability to launch and to land a missile in Los Angeles and kill people there. Yes, I would reserve that right, and I would make it clear to the Chinese. I would send an envoy to see the Chinese now and say there is a red line. We are not going to sit back and have our people targeted by this regime, and you can do something about it. And if you don't do something about it, you're going to have to live with the results. Yes, we have to protect Americans before we worry about anything else out here. So what can happen is the Koreans can stop all their crazy testing, and then we can get to a point where we can begin to talk about denuclearizing the whole peninsula. There's a lot of things we can talk about, but it needs to be made very clear to the Chinese. This is in your hands, and you don't want to do anything, you're going to have to live with the result, because we are not going to risk the lives of our people.
I do want to ask you about health care. The Republican effort, obviously, to repeal and replace Obamacare collapsed in the Senate. President Trump has threatened to stop the subsidy payments to Obamacare that help insurance companies pay for those who can afford it. So he made the August payment.
No, that would be a disaster.
You think that he should?
No, you can't do that.
Pledge.
No, he's got to continue to fund it. No, you cannot just cut this off and create more chaos. Look, John Hickenlooper, the governor of Colorado, Democrat, and I are working together on a plan that can stabilize those markets, which we'd be glad to present to people in the Senate. I'm hoping we're going to get an agreement on it. We're getting closer and closer. You got to do this in a bipartisan way, and the thing you have to do is stabilize those insurance markets. And if you want to, take away payments, you're going to create chaos. We can't have that. Let's stabilize those markets first. Let's not worry about Medicaid at this point. Let's get to Medicaid, Social Security, and Medicare in terms of a package to deal with the rising debt we have in this country and do that in a responsible way. There's ways to get this stuff done, Jake. Believe me, I've been there. I saw us reform welfare. I saw us balance the budget. I saw us reform the Pentagon. We can do it if people will just get off their political soapboxes and begin to think about the country. Because I got a message. We all get old and we all leave this planet. So we're going to be judged in many ways by what we did when we were here. Stop playing games. It just doesn't make any sense. Do something. Be bigger than yourself. Live a life bigger than yourself. That's where we need to go in Washington. That's where we need to go across the board in all of the United States with business and sports and religion across the board. Let's get our act together and think bigger than ourselves.
All right, inspirational words from Governor John Kasich. We always appreciate being here, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jake.
Opponents who celebrated the president's decision to fire Steve Bannon may have popped the proverbial champagne a little too soon. The former White House chief strategist has rejoined Breitbart News, and he's made it clear he is still going to fight for the Trump agenda, saying, quote, in many ways, I think I can be more effective fighting from the outside for the agenda President Trump ran on. And anyone who stands in our way, we will go to war with. Ending the sentence with a preposition notwithstanding. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, chairman of the House, ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, good to see you as always.
Good to see you, Jake.
So in response to President Trump's firing of Bannon, you tweeted, quote, glad to see Bannon gone. He never belonged in the White House, but the problem persists since the most profound source of division cannot be fired. Your position on President Trump and Bannon clear there. But let me ask you,